Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience. On this third day of exciting lectures, presentations, and a lot of memory sharing. Again, I'm Roland Gall. I'm Luxembourger, so a European. And looking at all this military hardware, especially at this Higgins boat with its open ram, gives me a shiver as a member of the post-World War II generation, picturing myself in such a boat over the ocean when it hits the beach and the ram opens. But this is, ladies and gentlemen, where liberty started. And my country, little Luxembourg in Western Europe, slightly larger than the state of Rhode Island, was liberated twice by American forces. And we have our hero, General Patton, which is also your hero, buried in Luxembourg. So I want to salute all the veterans and thank them again from the bottom of my heart and also from my countrymen. Thank you, America. When I was kindly invited to participate in this panel and I was offered this opportunity to basically moderate this subject, the war against Jim Crow, I had absolutely no idea what this meant, because this is a subject that's very little, if not totally unknown in Luxembourg. So I had to do some reading and I had to do some back-checking. And hopefully you won't mind me just introducing a little bit the subject, especially as we have some very young representatives here, which makes me also feel good. So just bear with me for 2 seconds, please, before I introduce our distinguished participants. From the 1880s up to World War II aftermath, a majority of American states enforced segregation through the so-called Jim Crow laws, called after a black character in minstrel shows, portrayed as a racist depiction of a poor and uneducated rural black man. Those discriminatory laws, regretfully, were primarily directed against African Americans, called, unfortunately, Negroes those days. They were enacted to support racial segregations. As numerous states had put it, also, the white and colored militia shall be separately enrolled and shall never be compelled to serve in the same organization. No organization of colored troops shall be permitted where white troops are available, and while white are permitted, organized colored troops shall be under the command of white officers. It is very difficult for us to understand that today, but looking back, it is not that far away back in time. But there were a few exceptions to this policy. For instance, there were some probational all-black, as they were called these days, all-colored units. For instance, there were tank units, artillery units, marine and naval construction units, and so forth. And of course, also not to forget the Red Ball Express. Red Ball Express was this lifeline, I mean, from the beaches to normally where the war was fought, where hundreds of African American soldiers made sure that the war effort got sustained. Let me also mention one prominent example of, for instance, African American units that fought in my country. It was the 761st Tank Battalion that distinguished itself during the Battle of the Bulge. Another unit within the U.S. Army Air Corps at that time were the famous Tuskegee Airmen. And I had the pleasure of welcoming 4 of these representatives recently to our museum on Luxembourg on a mission to Iraq, sponsored by the U.S. Air Force, because in near Luxembourg we have an American Air Force base in Germany. It was in June 1941, after the first black pilots were trained within this 99 Pursuit Squadron. They formed the core of other black squadrons forming at Tuskegee and Maxwell Fields. Of course, there were equally important black units and black troops in the Pacific Theater, for instance, the Marines and the Seabees, and not to forget African American nurses. And we have representatives of these 3 distinguished units with us today. Submitted to a degree possibly of a little bit lesser discrimination within the U.S. forces were probably Asian Americans in those days, especially the Japanese Americans, Hispanics, or perhaps other minorities of the pre-World War II multicultural, multi-ethnic society. Now, lately, the Japanese Americans were a special chapter in the World War II U.S. history. After Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese Americans primarily living on the West Coast were forced to sell their property at ridiculously low prices and abandon their homes. as enemy aliens, such as their classification in Executive Order number 9006, signed in 1942 by President Roosevelt. Japanese Americans were forced to resettle and were detained at some of these infamous relocation camps, such as Manzanar and Topaz. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a few distinguished representatives from these units with us today, and I'm pleased to introduce Colonel Charles McGee, a distinguished Tuskegee Airman flyer, Distinguished Flying Cross. Please welcome him. Mr. Gene Dowdy, a distinguished Munford Port Marine, fought in the Pacific. We have with us today Colonel Margaret Bailey, an Army Nurse Corps, and to represent the Japanese American community, Mrs. Mary Kawano Fong, who was interned in California. Thank you very much for joining us today, and let's get started immediately. So, Colonel Charles McGee, would you please kindly tell us a little bit about your life, your experience, your World War II experiences, and especially then how you experienced this infamous Jim Crow laws. Thank you.
Pleased to respond to that request, and we welcome you to our session this morning. Yesterday we talked about the actual air power performance of the Tuskegee Airmen, but it's today our subject is more of what did we overcome. And to begin this, we have to go back to 1925, and I'm going to read to you from a report to the Chief of Staff, and the subject is the use of Negro manpower in war. This is dated October 30th, 1925. Under the Constitution, the Negro has the rights of citizenship. He forms a considerable part of the population of the United States. The subject is how Negro manpower would be used in war. This report has under facts bearing on the problem. The Negro is physically qualified for combat duty. However, he is by nature subservient and believes himself to be inferior to the white man. He is most susceptible to the influence of crowd psychology. He cannot control himself in the fear of danger to the extent the white man can. He has not the initiative and resourcefulness of the white man. He is mentally inferior to the white man. It goes on to say that the Negro is a fair laborer, and his participation in World War I in combat was a failure. They forgot to talk to the French.
Yeah.
Political pressure at the time forced him to form two Negro combat units, infantry units. We're here to talk about the aviation experience. Now, this report ends, and I should read this to you. It is recommended that this study be taken as the basic policy of the Department for the use of Negro manpower. And this was policies and plans came from study over a culmination of several years by the faculty and student body of the Army War College. Well, I guess it's good that I can say it's good. A lot of us didn't know about this study and what was being said, because when America was building up its manpower to support our allies in Europe and become a part of it, the Negro American was just as patriotic and willing to serve as any other American. But it took a battle, and in our participation, it's often called about two V's: fighting for victory over Hitlerism in Germany, and the second was fighting over racism here in America. Now, there were those who, and by the way, Congress had some ideas, and there were laws passed relating to draft. That law said that there should be no discrimination based on race, creed, or color. We've added a few other things to that since that time. But that law was on the books, but not being abided by the predominant society all across America. The fight was for participation and equal access and choice of what we would want to do. Well, out of this policy, the War Department's position was, well, it's inimical to good order and discipline for blacks and whites to work together, so we can use our Negro manpower and labor units, but it had to be under white leadership, and certainly we would not mix black and whites in the same units, because we cannot eat and sleep and work and play together. So it had to be separate. That was the policy under which we were fighting for participation. Oh, we had cranial capacity less than a white, therefore could not absorb the technology to be involved in a field such as aviation. Blacks can't fly. Later General Davis, but then a West Pointer graduating in 1936 from the Army War College said, "I'd like to fly." And the Army told him, "You can't fly, we don't have any black units." So he didn't fly. He was aide to his father and professor of air science at Tuskegee Institute, and back to aide for his father. Pressure in 1939 around the country, they built up the Civilian Pilot Corps to increase the pool of pilots available to our service units, all of the services. At first, no, blacks can't fly wasn't included at black colleges. Finally, 5 or 6 black colleges had the civilian pilot training program. Get a license in a small plane, and those desiring to be military pilots going next door to the Army, Air Corps saying, "I want to be Army pilot." Army said, "Oh, we can't use a black pilot, even though you've learned to fly. We have no black mechanics." Now, those of you who know about that, it's kind of interesting, you know, that black can't fly an airplane by white mechanics, but that was Army policy. Can't use you. Pressure still continued, and it took a lawsuit by one of the graduates of the civilian pilot training program in Washington, as well as the pressure around the country from those believing it should be different, to get the Army Air Corps to say, "Okay, we'll experiment." An experiment. Aviation. We'll authorize one squadron, a pursuit squadron. We'll call it the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Oh, all the fine print and all of the necessary support. All of the necessary support, and I'll say a word about what that is in a moment. Wow. We've got to build an airfield for this program. Blacks and whites can't be together. They found $4 million to start building Tuskegee Army Airfield 9 miles out from Tuskegee, Alabama. Blacks can't fly. One of the laws passed was that the Army, to relieve its experienced officers, could contract the primary phase of Army training to a civilian pilot training school location. Tuskegee Institute had a very successful civilian pilot training program, including moving into the secondary phase of training and other training instructors. Besides just getting a pilot's license, they began to train instructors. They applied and got the Army contract for this experiment. One squadron, folks, is 30 pilots. All of that necessary support, though, is close to 400 other people. All of this, besides the direct support, some 200, and others, your engine mechanics and those that maintain and keep the aircraft flying. But this included the medics, it included administration and supply and ordnance, and yes, even the field maintenance required for that unit to go into combat. The training started in 1941, and the instructors that Tuskegee Institute was using in the other black schools that had civilian pilot training programs were black pilots who followed Bessie Coleman's Aero Clubs in the 30s, and there were some 100 black pilots around America, even though the Army was saying that the blacks can't fly. My first instructor in class 43F in the flying program was a black pilot in the PT-17 under that Army contract to have the primary phase of training for this experiment that the Army was taking. Well, the 99th Pursuit Squadron began their training. The mechanics, by the way, were trained at Chanute Field in Rantoul, Illinois. Actually, the 99th was started there because I mentioned the Army policy was got to have black mechanics before we can have black pilots. So the mechanics actually started their training at Chanute Field. As they completed their training, they were shipped south to Maxwell Field in Montgomery, but Tuskegee Army Airfield was still being built. Maxwell would not use those mechanics, even though they needed them at the time, but they sat there on the other side of the field under restrictions that are not a part of our subject today, waiting for Tuskegee Army Airfield to open. Well, the 99th pilots began their training in 1941. Those some 30 pilots by the end of the year and into 1942 were complete. They were mated up with their mechanics, and they're combat ready in December of 1943. I'm sorry, 1942. Army had a problem. What white commander is going to take a black unit under theirs? It took them 4 months to finally ship the 99th and all of their necessary support to North Africa, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group. Not at the base of the 33rd, because segregation, America's going to take segregation overseas. They tried to tell the folks over there, be careful how you treat and operate with these folks, because they've got problems. The 99th went to their own base. They did get brand new P-40s to begin their combat, but they had to send an officer over to the 33rd's location, get their briefing, come back to their base, and then go fly their missions. But the command attitude was reflected in the reports by Colonel Momeyer on the 99th's experience. Not aggressive, only shot down one aircraft, should be patrolling Liberia. Well, the Army, in the meantime, realizing that as replacements were needed, continued the training at Tuskegee and authorized additional single-engine fighter pilot training for a fighter squadron. These pilots also trained in the P-40. Now, the 99th proved that blacks could fly the aircraft given the opportunity. They still hadn't been proved their ability in combat. Hearings were going on here in Washington by those who didn't like the idea of blacks moving into the aviation field, but the program continued because of the need and what was going on as the war progressed. I mentioned command attitude of the 33rd Fighter Commander because a little bit later, and by the way, they kept the 99th in combat after those hearings because reports up through Eisenhower's command showed that the 99th accuracy and ability to put bombs on target we're just as good as any of the other units over there fighting as we push the Germans out of North Africa. We took Pantelleria without the ground forces even having to go there from the bombings into Sicily and out of Sicily into Italy. When the 99th was moved into Italy, they were assigned to the 79th Fighter Group, but this commander's attitude was different. So if there was any first integration, it took place with the 99th flying with the 79th Fighter Group out of Italy. And over the Anzio beachhead in an 8-day time frame, the 99th pilot shot down 17 German aircraft that were trying to defend our advancement. Oh, blacks can fly in combat, again, given the opportunity. But that changed. No, it didn't change Army policy then, because behind the 99th came the 332nd Fighter Group, 3 fighter squadrons, combat ready in the P-40, and they said, we're changing your mission to P-39. They still had patrol in mind, and the 332nd Fighter Group was sent directly to Italy. That was the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Squadrons to perform harbor and coastal patrol from Naples up to the Anzio beachhead. Well, folks, our bombers are now out of North Africa and flying from southern Italy deep into the German held territories and defenses, and our bomber losses in some cases were running over 50% of a squadron as they tried to destroy Germany's war-making potential. And this goes all the way from the delayed landings in France to the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, so from one end of the European continent to the other. Our bombers needed escort because, you know, when every bomber went down, 10 American lives were possibly lost. They picked 4 fighter groups to form 15. This tactical work that was being done was 12th Air Force. They formed 15th Air Force, picked 4 fighter groups to begin the escort of our B-17s and B-24s. The 332nd Fighter Group was one of those 4 groups picked. And in combat, we gave the P-39s to the Russians that we were flying and picked up the P-47 Thunderbolt, beginning the escort and moving from the Naples area to the Adriatic side of the Italian peninsula. The escort work was for protecting in the high altitude and strategic work of our B-17s and B-24s. The 332nd only had the P-47 for about 2 months, and the famed P-51 Mustang became available there in theater for all of the groups that were doing the escort. And they asked an old fighter pilot why we always emphasize the P-51. It had higher altitude capability, greater speed, and greater range than the other fighters that are available. The others, P-47 was good and did its job, but for the strategic work, and particularly for escorting our B-17s, the P-51 became the old fighter pilot's favorite aircraft. But in this escort work, the 332nd Fighter Group performed some 200 escort missions. We had great leadership in Ben Davis Jr., who even told us, young and race fighter pilots, second lieutenants, first lieutenants, and later some captains, that I'll court-martial the pilot that goes happy hunting. What that means, happy hunting, is that you're escorting some bombers, but you hear that there's some fighters in the air and you're anxious to become an ace, so you leave your bombers, go to try to find one of those fighters to shoot them down. We stayed with the bombers that we were assigned and only left them when they were actually attacked by the Focke-Wulf 190s or the Messerschmitts, and would fight them off if they attacked the bombers that we're escorting. We also, if we had fuel, would assign crews to support the stragglers, aircraft with engines out that had to drop out of their bombing formation we would stay with them as long as we could. I need, as my time is getting pretty tight here, I want to mention one other part of it. So that experience changed the attitude, not necessarily of our military people, because we were still segregated. Our own base, our whole own operation, and we even had bombers struggling, trying to get back to their base and having to land wherever they could. Some were happy to have a meal and sleep on the cot of somebody away, even though it was a black unit and they found out there was a black operation going on. And there were others who still just felt that wasn't right and would go on and take a cold truck ride as soon as they could get it back to their base rather than participate together. The other portion that I want to talk in this WWII battle very quickly is that even though the Army policy may have continued in the form of being segregated, they added medium bomber training to the Tuskegee program in the mid-1943, a couple months after I graduated. And the medium bomber training was for the Mitchell B-25, and they had the 477th Bomb Group. Again, in this case, 4 squadrons and all of their necessary support. Training to go to the Pacific. They fought the battle at home because the commander at the base, Tuskegee Army Airfield, so crowded by this time, they were moved up to Indiana and Kentucky for their training, combat training, as pilots graduated and the crews came together. And the base commander, though, wanted to still maintain segregation. Army regulations say that there's an officers club for officers, there's a club for the NCOs, and people use the base facilities. Well, this commander, Colonel Selway, with General Hunter's approval in 1st Air Force, said, I'll write a base regulation and control this. His regulation said trainees on my base will only use the facilities I authorize. Well, who's in training? 477 Bomb Group to go to the Pacific. He said, your officers cannot use the officers club. The officers decided in 2s and 3s to go to the officers club. 101 were arrested for trying to enter the officers club and not use the building that he had designated for trainees. Investigation, of course, came out of that. That commander was relieved, but the Army Air Corps still had a problem. You've got the 332nd Fighter Group. The war ended in Europe. We hadn't dropped the bomb yet out, but when we did, the unit deployments began to back off shortly after we dropped the bombs there, and the Army Air Corps said, now what do we do? So they formed a composite group and kept 2 of the B-25 squadrons and that 99th, our 1st Pursuit Squadron, but they still said, what do we do now? Godman Field in Kentucky and Freeman Field in Indiana, too small. They moved everybody to Lockburn Air Base in Columbus, Ohio. That was a move, and so if any time you hear somebody say that we had a black Air Force, they're talking about the time that the 477th Composite Group moved and occupied Lockburn Air Base. Well, the United States Air Force became a separate service in 1947. And the Air Force, in their studies, determined or found out 2 things. Number 1, they said we need to use people based on their training and experience and where needed, not the color of their skin or their happenstance of birth. And secondly, we're not getting enough money to maintain Lockburn Air Base on an equal basis. We intend to integrate. Army hadn't integrated. The Air Force said we intend to. A few months later, a very courageous President Harry Truman issued 2 executive orders. One had to do with equal hiring throughout the federal government, but the one we're concerned with was 9981, which said all of the services shall integrate. He didn't give a timetable, but he said the buck stops here.
Yeah.
Here's the message. All shall integrate. Now, when the Air Force became a separate service, they had no use at the time for that composite group. So the 332nd Fighter Group was reactivated as a wing base operation there at Lockburn, flying the P-47 aircraft. 3 squadrons now. And what I didn't say was there in Europe in July when we got the P-51 aircraft, the decision then was to assign the 99th to the 332nd Fighter Group also. So standard group, 3 squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. We add the 99th, so even though we weren't wanted, we had the largest fighting group for 15th Air Force from July on through the end of the war. Very late, just before the war ended, they deactivated the 302nd, went back to its standard three squadron group. But what did this accomplish? Even though our society wasn't ready, it proved that we can respect each other, that we can eat, sleep, work, and play together, and that we can, out of our abilities, add to the strength of these United States. In July 1, well, first let me say, the first annual Air Force meet for Top Guns was in May of 1949. A number of years later, the Air Force began publishing a list of the top guns of the Air Force. And in this report, and I think it was in the late 60s, they had 1949 unknown, and then went on from 1950 to name the Top Gun winners. Well, folks, the Top Gun winners in May of 1949 in the reciprocating engine phase were pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group flying the P-47N. But in July 1 of 1949, the Air Force closed Lockburn Air Base, and the Negroes who were still participating in the service were really scattered around the world. Now, the program produced 992 pilots. Some 600 or more were single-engine pilots, and over 400 of those participated in the war, North Africa, and Italy, flying out of the Mediterranean theater. There were over 200 medium bomber pilots out of the program, and as I said, all of the necessary support was some 10 to 12,000 people when you look at all of the support for those 8 squadrons. The military led the way, folks, in the early civil rights actions and movement in the country. And I'll close my remarks with that statement. Thank you.
Okay.
May I just add that Colonel McGee is a holder of the Distinguished Flying Cross, and that after the war he continued in the Air Force and had tours in Korea and also in Vietnam. Thank you very much. Our next distinguished panelist, also representing the African American community enrolled in the Marine Corps at Montfort Point and fought in the Pacific. Please welcome Mr. Gene Dowdy. So, Mr. Dowdy, would you please tell us about your experiences on the other side of the globe?
Absolutely. Well, it's indeed a pleasure. I would call it long overdue. I find, since I've been here since Wednesday, the various panels understand that been experienced and worked with, and the groups there, the attention that's been given, it's wonderful to see a group of people, the audience, giving so much heed and giving so much attention to the subject matter. And I appreciate that because it tells me that you are caring and concerned. And for those educators out there and the biographers and whatever film producer they are, I would hope they would take heed, and I'm sure that they will learn and grasp enough of this very historical messages that are being given. So again, thank you. A very grateful thanks to you. I'm going to try to capsulize this as best as I can and make sure that we have a full understanding. I prefer taking the route to having this chronologized if I can. I think it would be more apt, and this way, understand, sticking to the problem and sticking to the nature of the problem and the era. Understand that these developments occurred. I'm going to take you now back just before, or rather, the pre-Pearl Harbor disaster, and 1940. That's a very comfortable year because a lot went on during the year 1940 when the war, of course, the world was engaged in a lot of hostilities. It was not yet a global war, but it was getting close to it. 1940, of course, America was still suffering from the Depression. Not as bad. There was some progress, but yet not enough progress. There was still a lot of animosity. There was a lot of political fanfare. And as you know, understand, the concept was, as it was back in the First World War, is to keep America out of the war. Of course, there were differences of opinions. There's too much savagery and so much around the world that was conducted, understand, from dictatorships. How could we very much understand linger along without getting involved? One of the things that was very problematic there on the home front, and it was domestic, is what are we going to do about the poverty level? We still had a vast number of men and women who were jobless, who were homeless, and just lying around. The point was that America had to do something about this problem. FDR and his cabinet members then had made several attempts with several programs. They did have programs, no question about it. But were those programs really working to the benefit of all concerned? One was called the FEPC, better known as the Fair Employment Practice Commission. And that FEPC certainly reflected, very simply, it's a long recording, but I won't even attempt to do that, but simply telling you, the American people, or telling the employees, those who survived and had established businesses, etc., that we must, despite color and race and religious sects, those people who are capable, who had professions, should be given first consideration. I said all races, etc. That was the FEPC. Well, that lingered on for a while. It had some attraction, but still, we weren't going anywhere with it. It came to a few people, including Mrs. FDR, better known as Eleanor Roosevelt, and a few of the cabinet members there, decided that in the best interest of all, if we are going to really do something about it, And when I say that now, I'm talking not only about on the domestic front, and not talking about civil jobs, et cetera. We're talking about the military as well, because we still had some problems with the military. And if we were going to expand the military, and if we were going and bent on doing what we have to do, then you've got to make very serious changes. So it came to a point there where there was so much frustration and so much animosity, again, political fanfare. Well, when it comes to the military, how are we going to handle that? One phase was pointed out in the Marine Corps, you don't have one single military personnel. Are you aware, or are the American people still aware, that there are no black Marines in that segment in the military? Well, that's a good point of view. Well, we've got to do something about that. Then we have to open the doors somewhere, somehow. And it came to a point, without any further ado, it came to a point when President Roosevelt had to issue a presidential order. And that's what it was. They had to issue an order in order for blacks to go into the Marine Corps. Again, now, it was a good point of view, it was important, but the most prioritized item on that bill, of course, was to make sure that the American people, the civilian workers, people who had skills and everything else there, could and should be in the mills and the plants. And if you're preparing to stand for a global war, then you better get your logistics together in a hurry. And how could you very well do that without the absence of a tremendous percentage of people who had potentials for the growth? And so it came to the point where the Navy Department was not too very happy about black Marines. They said, what do we do with them? Don't you find that absurd? What do we do with them? Well, what do you do with any personnel whom seemingly are qualified? And in some cases, overqualified, depending on the type of personnel you're getting. Well, then the Commandant said, well, if we have to take black Marines, then we will take the best of black Marines. And so it came to the point where in July of 1942, there was a vast recruitment for potential blacks. High school education, absolutely mandatory. If you had a year of college or 2 years, well, by all means, we'll take you too. If you have a PhD, oh, we'll take you right away. So that was established. I was 19 years old when I received word that the Marine Corps was looking for me because I had a year of college. I completed high school, had a year of college. And so I became among the first 100 blacks from New York City to be selected by the Marine Corps. That was in the year end of 1942. When I went or left there, let me back up a little bit. I was born in Stamford, Connecticut, and I relocated with the family to New York City. I had all my education practically in New York City. Never went south. Knew a little bit about the Mason-Dixon line. Knew a little bit about Jim Crowism. knew a little bit about segregation, but I got this in drips and encapsulated form, so I really didn't know the real depth of discrimination. And boy, was I in for some surprises. So finally, when I got my papers and I left for Washington, D.C., we went by train, then I found out that we had to take another train. As you recall, during that time, those days, you had the electric lines and stand right to Washington, D.C., and that was your the end of your electric power trains. And you took the coal trains. And where did I sit? In the last car where all the soot was. I believe it was the first car. The first car had all the soot, was it? Yeah, the first car. That's where I was instead, until I reached a town called Rocky Mount, North Carolina. And when I got off at North Carolina, it was, this can't be America. What I'm saying is that it looked more like a European mountain villa. There was hardly no one stirring there. It was just dark, desolated. It was not a good place to be, especially that time in the morning. And I was approached by two military policemen from a nearby camp, and they wanted to know what I was doing and where I was going, and I showed them my papers. And they looked at the papers and it says, "Oh, you're going down to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, that's where I'm destined to." I said, "I'm going for recruit training." Instead of an encouraging word, instead of a clam handshake and says, "Well, glad to have you aboard," the response was, "You'll be sorry." And to make it even more darkened, there were two pine boxes to my right. And the MP says, "See those two guys there? They're just coming from Montfort Point." Well, that was a scary tactic. I later found out that was not so. They were coming from another location. They weren't coming from Montfort Point Camp, where I was destined for. But it goes to show you the kind of reception, the kind of ill concern for someone, a young man like myself, going to the military to support his country. And this is what I get in return. Well, finally, when I got to Montfort Point Camp, of course, there were no black drill instructors. They were all white drill instructors, mostly from the South. And all they had to do is find out that I was from New York City. "Oh, you're one of those city slickers. You know, we got a lot of guys from," and they talked only about the northern towns, Detroit, New York, Chicago, you know, even the parts of Wisconsin. And they gave us the business. This is what we think about you guys. Now, are you ready to leave? Just like that. Well, again, it came to the point there where I had to take these things in stride. I said to myself, either this is a psychological approach, or they wanted to know if I could take the pressure. And if you know the Marine Corps, especially in recruit training, they will do anything in the stand to bust you and break you down. Once you've graduated from a Marine boot camp, believe me, you're a Marine. They will do everything in the stand to make sure that you can take the pressure. Getting back to the segregated point of view here, those of us who've been in the military know that there were only two recruit depots. One, of course, Parris Island, South Carolina, and San Diego, California. But during World War II, there was a third recruit depot. That recruit depot was called Montford Point. Montford Point was a small, segregated camp in the confines of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. That's where all blacks were recruited and trained. Well, the training was the same as our counterparts. They were prepared to launch us or place us in what they called the Stewards Branch Battalion. Stewards Branch Battalion, that's cooks and bakers. I said to myself, what do they do? Do you mean, say, if a guy comes in with a PhD or has had several years in engineering and communication, do you mean that this poor guy is going to be destined to be a cook? This is what I said. But what I didn't know was that the Marine Corps had a plan for the blacks long before it was established. And they said if they could get the caliber of people, personnel, that they wanted to have, they were going to form a special weapons company with upgraded special weapons and eventually have a defense battalion. And in the defense battalion of special weapons, you've got to have a knowledge of firing and know everything there. A lot of expertise is involved. So that's what they really had advanced. So that was a myth about every black Marine who went down to Montford Point during the pioneer days, either was a cook or became a cook or was destined to be a cook. No, that's a myth. The Marine Corps knew what they were going to do with the blacks. We ended up at Montford Point during the first 3 months of recruitment with the most diversified number of people that one can imagine. Remember now, we are canvassing the entire United States, so you had men, blacks, from all over the country, from Maine to Washington, from Washington to South Carolina. Men, understand, that were beyond the expectations of what the Marine Corps wanted. Again, we had fellows who came with PhDs. We had fellows who had the college education. We had fellows who were like 10 years. I was 19 years old. The average black then, of course, was about 19 years old. And they were selecting men, understand, 10 years my senior. Those are the people, understand, that really were the attraction because they were well into their professions. Some of them had their units, and some were doctors, some were engineers, etc. Diversification to the limit. I'm very, very happy about that. So at this point, the Marine Corps felt very comfortable with that. We were able to establish school companies. When I graduated from from Recruit Depot, I was placed into Headquarters Battalion, and I soon became an instructor in business administration. That is my major. I stayed there for a little while, understand, and shipped out maybe 12 or 13 months later. But getting back now to Montford Point, the discriminatory practices, of course, still prevail at home and abroad. If a fellow went out on furlough in nearby, maybe 100 miles out, or even further, anywhere, we knew of incidents where men, American black Marines, were arrested on sight. Those who arrested those personnel had no idea that they were blacks in the Marine Corps. They were ignorant to the fact and saying that they weren't of them. And they were arrested and at times saying had to remain in the brig until it was until then the superior officer stand was able to release them. And so that's exactly what happened. I think my time is about up, but I want to say to you that when I spent 32 consecutive days on Iwo Jima, I was a corporal, head of a squad. I had the privilege of, and it was a privilege, of being among a numerous number of men at the time they were consecrated the 5th Marine Division Cemetery. And there was a Jewish rabbi, Dr. Gedelson, who was asked to make the consecration. And Dr. Gedelson said, and I never forgot those words, they're still etched into my heart. And he simply said, "Here lie men, here lie Jewish, Episcopalians, Baptists, and other religious sects. Here lies perhaps a man or men who could have been a chemist, a lawyer, a doctor, even a person who would one day discover the cure for cancer. They are here in the purest democracy. And any man who dares raises a hand or uses contempt to one another, then this whole ceremony, this whole consecration is just a mere hollow mockery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gene, indeed, for this striking story. Representing the female African American community of World War II, Colonel Margaret Bailey was a young U.S. Army nurse in 1944, and she was at a POW camp in Arizona. She retired in 1971 with the Legion of Merit for exceptional meritorious conduct, and she also published her memoirs in a book called The Challenge. May we have your story, please, Colonel?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Okay. The war against Jim Crow and discrimination. I was born in Selma, Alabama, raised in Mobile, Alabama, and received much of my education in the South. Encountered many difficulties in receiving that, some that has been enumerated by the gentlemen who have just spoken. So you can see that we had a big job to do with creating this war against discrimination. I received my nursing education in Montgomery, Alabama, and worked a little bit in civilian hospitals, and then went to New York and worked there at Seaview Hospital, Staten Island, New York. We heard one of the patients cried out, and all of us nurses ran to see what has happened. Well, Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and that was her home. And so that was the beginning of the war. Of course, they needed nurses, and so they advertised for nurses. And most nurses were very patriotic, or quite a number, let's say, and they applied, black and white. Well, the black nurses applied, and they said, there is no regulations that will permit us to receive you in the military. Well, that was quite a shock. We knew there were going to be patients, and many of them. But I think they underestimated the power of women. When that when they said that, nursing organizations throughout the country and Mrs. Roosevelt, they all made beelines to the Surgeon General's office saying, you must receive these women. Well, after this is my version, and I guess he said, I'm sick of these women. Okay, we'll take 54. And 54 black nurses were received in the military. Well, what did they do with them? Well, they said, we'll take you, but you can only take care of black soldiers. I thought that's strange. So we came in with that in mind. You always, you know, take what you can, and a little later on, maybe you'll get more. So we did. And they sent these nurses to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And there they remained, and not one of us were able to go overseas to really assist our sister nurses. But we did take care of the soldiers who came back, so we figured we did a great job. But saying that we could only take care of black soldiers, it limited us. The 43rd Division was at Fort Huachuca, and they were black soldiers. They were sent overseas. Now, what are you going to do with all of these black nurses? You don't have any black soldiers. And of course, we had the German and the Italian prisoners of war at that time. And I was sent to the prisoner of war camp at Florence, Arizona. Florence, Arizona was supposedly a bit liberal. They had one black family living in the area. When we arrived, signs went up. We reserved the right to refuse anybody. So that meant that we black nurses at Florence could not go into the establishments there. But you know, we didn't even try there because Phoenix, the bus ran from the camp to Phoenix, so we all took the bus and went into Phoenix and had a nice lunch and shopped because they were far more liberal than Florence, Arizona. But the prisoners of war were not difficult to take care of because they were very happy to have been captured by Americans because they said they knew that they would get good care. And they did get good care. There we stayed, maybe 6 or 8 months at the camp. Then we went to Camp Beale. That was a little bit better. You had integrated soldiers, but the nurses were still segregated. We lived in our own barracks, and we worked together, but we did not eat or play together. And that proceeded until, let me say, I went to Halloran Hospital, Fort Dix, New Jersey. All of those, we were still segregated. And we thought, one day, this is going to disappear. And we always hoped that it would happen. And I think I was at school at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And I went there to take a course in psychiatry. And I think the teachers were totally aware of the fact. There were 3 black nurses. They put one in one building, one at the end of the other building, and the other one at the end. And this was the beginning of trying to integrate us, and it forced us to study together, and we did, and we all did well. From there, I went overseas, and I believe when Mr. Truman said integration no longer, that is when we began to integrate. They don't do it right away. It is a gradual thing, and gradually we all became integrated. And strangely enough, as I said to someone, when we were totally integrated, then shall I say, I can use the white nurses accepted us quite well, but there wasn't any difficulty. The rules, the laws were the things that permitted us not to be integrated. And from that time on, we worked very well together. I like to say that taking care of the soldiers as they came back from overseas was a pleasure. And there was a time they wanted to know whether we wanted to, when the war ended, they wanted to know whether we wanted to stay in the military, quite a number of us. And I was one of those who said, okay, I'll stay. And I stayed, and I spent 27 years in the military, and I was able to move from, when we said a private to a general, I would say from a second lieutenant to a colonel, which was the highest rank that women could receive at that time in the military. And we did a fine job of really getting discrimination off the book. I would say to you that that was very good, but I don't want you to be, today it's interesting, you must watch. There is a little undercurrent. It hasn't gone totally, but we do work well. And I must say, it was a pleasure being a nurse in the military, taking care of the soldiers. There's nothing greater, of course being a nurse, there's nothing greater than taking care of people. And that I love. And since I spent my career doing that, I feel very honored. And to have done it in the military, I feel twice as honored.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a very strong statement indeed. Thank you, Colonel Bailey, for this exciting eye-opener. May we now turn over to the Japanese American community and to Mrs. Mary Kawano Fong. Mary, you were a 14-year-old girl when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and at that time you lived in a small farming community and rural environment in California. And as a result of Pearl Harbor, your family was relocated at Arboga Assembly Center and later on to Camp Tula Lake across the Californian-Oregon border. Apart from the fears, the restrictions, and the poor conditions in those camps, the worst scars were doubtlessly the hurt feelings and broken hearts of Japanese immigrants who had chosen the U.S. as their country. Mary, may we hear your story, please?
My name is Mary Kawano Fong, and I'm a survivor of World War II American internment camp for Japanese people. I'm now 79 years young, and, and I think I'm finally old enough, mature enough, strong enough to tell my story. It is not an easy story to tell, but it is important for Americans of all backgrounds and ethnicities to know my story. I know my story is one of many that have been told, but my story is important because it is about me, how I survived, and if I don't hurry, my story will never be told. I was 14 when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Like many teenagers, my life revolved around my little problems, not big problems like war. I wanted to find ways to solve my little problems of jealousy and longing for something better. The Japanese families in our community of Loomis, California were similar to mine. They worked long, hard hours on the farms and fields and had very little money for the nice things teenagers hoped for. I didn't want to be a poor Japanese family person. I hoped for a better life, though at 14 I stumbled around without direction. I just knew I wasn't satisfied with what I had. I was not any different than any other 14-year-old, rich or poor. Despite my teen angst, life was peaceful in Loomis until the horror of Pearl Harbor. When war was declared, my parents were very prescient and fearful of what was looming for their little family. My first real cause for concern was when, out of the blue, a curfew was imposed on all citizens of Japanese descent. We could not be found on the streets after 7, and when we were out and about, restricted to 5 to 7 mile radius. Violators would be picked up. Unbeknownst to me, when the war was declared, the curfews imposed, my mother immediately purchased yards of canvas from which she sewed duffel bags. And that is what, if you filled one of those, each one was allowed to carry one to camp. And mother and father knew, being members of the now enemy race, would be relocated. I, however, had my head in the sand. After all, I'm an American. In May of 42, we were sent to Arboga Assembly Center in the swamps near Beale Air Force Base in Marysville. When I saw the horrible conditions of camp, I was completely overcome with hate and anger. Like animals, we were herded into the fenced compound. Overcrowded, everyone jostled for space. The food was terrible, the toilets and baths were unsanitary and disgusting. For a girl who strived to overcome the stigma of being poor Japanese farmer's daughter, the shock of what I faced in Arboga was too much for me to bear. My mind and body could not cope, and I became very despondent and physically and mentally ill. But my parents were strong and understanding. They assessed my situation and helped me. My father was my very best friend and a self-made psychologist. Helped me through my trauma. He would walk me around the camp, talk to me about the reasons for being in such a horrible place. He told me that the war would last 4 years and that the U.S. government had ordered all Japanese Americans to be incarcerated for the safety of the country. He said we had no choice, that no one can fight the government, and that was why the Japanese Americans were in camp. He advised me to do the best to overcome my illness and he promised to help me. He encouraged me to have a positive attitude and to try to enjoy each day, to smile even if I didn't want to, and told me that if I could not change my outlook on life, I may risk the chance of going to Napa or Stockton to the mentally ill. After 3 months of incarceration in Arboga, we were moved by train to Camp Tule Lake, which was still under construction upon our arrival. It was here that my healing accelerated because it was here that I found new friends. And the 4 of us, along with me, were just teenagers, and we needed each other's support. These 4 were very positive influences on my health and my mental health. And to this day, we are still in touch. 65 years later, we get together, and it's as though we were never apart. And the one incident I remembered when I was a senior in high school, I was nominated by the student body, along with a friend, Michio Yamamoto, as best citizens. And we got to leave camp and get in a car with 2 guards and our school sponsor or class sponsor, and we got to go to Klamath Falls, Oregon for dinner. The food was not necessarily very good, but it was fun to be just 2 people who were not in camp for about an hour. But the look on the customers' faces it was very hard to take. When you think that you're just a young teenager, 2 teenagers, and people were definitely afraid to see us come into the restaurant and started to actually leave their dinners and leave the restaurant. That was very frightening to me. And one big incident that happened was my father worked as a farmer. He sharecropped a 40-acre ranch and worked solely on this ranch. My mother went out as a day laborer and worked in the fields, picking prunes, olives, grapes, whatever. But when we went to camp, he decided that he was going to work as a carpenter. And one evening, vandals burned the hallway that connected the gym to the administration building. So the next day, my father's crew was tearing down the roof that was burned to remove it and restore it with new, and build a new roof line there. There were 5 men on the crew, and my father, along with 3 others, were on one side, and there was 1 man on the other, so my dad decided he would go over and help this man. In the process of going across, the roof caved in and killed him. I went to a pilgrimage at the 50th anniversary of our return from Tule Lake. We went to a pilgrimage, and people are asking, why are you here? What did you think you were going to see? What do you think you'll get out of this trip? I just wanted to see the camp and to see what was left, and there was nothing left. All the barracks were gone. There were some tumbleweeds, and it was just a huge nothing. But on the bus, going from the graveyard to the campsite, a lady sat next to me, and her name was Adeline Sakita Monzo. Adeline said she was there on that trip because she hoped to find someone who saw the accident that killed my father. She said when she saw it, she was sitting in the classroom, and she was either in the 7th or 8th grade, and the teacher told her, pay attention to the lessons. She closed the shades and told the class, you did not see anything. Adeline went running home after school and told her mother about this, and her mother said, you mustn't spread rumors. That's very bad of you to do that, Adeline. So Adeline was, if I was 14, she must have been, I don't know, 11 or 12. So she said, okay. And she tried to put it out of her mind. When she thought she was over it, but she would have nightmares of this. She would see 2 feet sticking out of from the roof line, and she would see these green pants. And she said it was like a ghosty mist. And as the years went by, 50 years, and she told her mother, I still see that dream. And her mother said, you are absolutely crazy, Adeline. And when we discussed the reasons we were there, I told her I just wanted to see the old campsite. And she said, I just want to find out if anybody knows about this man that I saw crushed under the roof. And I said, you're talking about my father. And needless to say, we had a very weepy session, but that was the one thing that she came for. She and I have remained friends, and she says that I got rid of this misty green nightmare she was having for over 50 years. So we did that.
Thank you, Mary. Unfortunately, we ran out of time and we won't have time for Q&A, but thank you again to all of you for another eye-opener and a reminder that all men are equal. After all, the blood that was spilled for our liberty had only one color, red. Thank you very much.